Welcome to Viso W. This is the deep dive.
Hmm.
And this is where we take the sources you've shared with us, articles, notes, maybe online discussions, all that stuff, and we really try to pull out the key insights.
Yeah, the things that matter, the surprising bits, the context you need.
Exactly. Our mission really is to help you get properly informed and quickly by sort of cutting through all the noise.
It's about tackling that information overload together, right?
Yeah.
Looking at what you've given us, working through it, and seeing what connects.
Absolutely. And today, well, we've got a really fascinating set of sources. They touch on some pretty big and sometimes quite contentious areas.
Definitely.
We're going to kick things off looking back at U.S. history, specifically a period often called the era of good feelings. But, well, we'll see if that label really holds up.
Spoiler, it's complicated. Then we'll kind of zoom out a bit
Right.
and think about history itself using another source. Explore this idea. Can history actually help us understand, maybe even cool down, some of the conflicts we see now, like on university campuses?
That's a fascinating idea. And then finally, we're going to dive deep into something very current, very debated. A U.S. Department of Justice memo about capital punishment. We'll spend a good bit of time looking really closely at the language in that memo.
Yeah, and the reactions to it. There's a specific online discussion you sent that shows just how polarized the interpretations are. We'll get into that.
So think of this as us exploring these sources right alongside you. We'll keep it structured, but hopefully it feels like a really clear, insightful conversation about all this material.
Let's do it.
All right, let's get started. Part 1, exploring historical peaks and valleys of American unity.
Okay. So, our first source takes us back, way back, to the early 19th century, right after the War of 1812.
Ah, yes, the era of good feelings. I remember learning about this.
Right. The source brings up this historical claim, that these years, roughly during James Monroe's presidency, were supposedly marked by this real national unity.
And on the surface, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? The source mentions the Federalist Party was basically fading away after opposing the war, leaving the Democratic Republicans as pretty much the only game in town. You'd think one dominant party means less fighting, right? Seems peaceful compared to now.
Well, yeah, that's the surface look. But what's really compelling is how the source immediately adds this caveat.
Okay.
It highlights that historians often use that term, era of good feelings, with a heavy dose of irony, or at least skepticism.
Irony. So it wasn't actually that great.
Well, they see it less as describing the reality and more as maybe reflecting the hopes of the time, or maybe just how things looked on the surface.
Okay, so why the skepticism then? What was bubbling underneath? What does the source say was really going on?
The source is pretty clear that unity was, well, largely superficial. Yes, the Federalists were gone as a national force, but the disagreements, the competing interests, they didn't just vanish.
Ah, so they just moved inside the big party.
Exactly. The source says they fractured within the Democratic-Republican Party itself. You know the old saying, if you don't have outside enemies.
You find internal ones. Right.
So instead of one unified party, it was more like this. Big tent,
Yeah.
full of different factions, different regional interests, people who really didn't agree on some fundamental stuff.
And the source mentions this was happening even within President Monroe's own administration.
Yeah, specifically mentions factionalism there, where it tells you, debates about policy, regional fights, ideology.
Huh.
It was all still simmering away.
So it wasn't genuine consensus. It was just that the dissent hadn't quite organized into separate parties yet.
That's a good way to put it. And the force points out that this whole period, despite the name, wasn't exactly tranquil, especially when you look at the big events happening during it or right after.
Okay, what were those key disruptors? What did the source highlight?
Well, first big one, the Panic of 1819.
The Panic of 1819.
Right.
A major economic depression.
Yeah, the first really widespread financial crisis in the U.S. The source mentions it was partly triggered by, land speculation bubbles, especially out west, and banks being a bit loose with lending. Then credit suddenly tightened up, the bubble burst.
And disaster followed. Bankruptcies, foreclosures.
Widespread unemployment, yeah.
Hmm.
And economic pain, well, it rarely brings people together, does it?
No, definitely not. It usually leads to finger pointing.
Precisely. And the source says the panic didn't just cause personal hardship. It exposed these deep regional economic divides. Farmers out west and in the south drowning in debt. They blamed the banks, especially the Second Bank of the United States.
Which was seen as being controlled by Eastern money interests, right?
Exactly. So any sense of harmony built on economic good times, that evaporated pretty quickly,
Right.
replaced by resentment and conflicting interests.
Okay, so economic trouble was a huge crack in the good feelings. What else did the source point to?
The Missouri Compromise of 1820. Huge.
Ah, yeah. The fight over admitting Missouri as a state?
Right. And the core issue was slavery. Would Missouri come in as a free state or a slave state? Adding it either way would upset the balance of power in the Senate.
Which was evenly split at the time.
Perfectly balanced. And each side, free and slave states, was desperate to keep it that way to protect their interests, especially, concerning slavery.
So how did the compromise work again?
Well, the source reminds us Missouri came in as a slave state, but Maine was admitted simultaneously as a free state to keep that balance.
Okay.
And it drew that line, 36° 30' latitude, across the Louisiana Purchase territory. Slavery was prohibited north of that line, except in Missouri itself.
But the source indicates this whole fight really strained things.
Severely. It brought the issue of slavery,
Yeah.
a really explosive issue, right to the forefront. Thomas Jefferson famously called it.
A firebell in the night.
Yeah, exactly. A warning. He saw it signaled an existential threat to the Union. The force presents it as a temporary fix, not a real solution. It just laid bare these deep sectional divides that would only get worse, really challenged the whole idea of a unified nation.
Wow. So even during the so-called era of good feelings, you've got the first big economic crash and this massive fight over slavery that foreshadows the Civil War. That really, it makes the label seem almost ridiculous.
It certainly puts it into perspective, doesn't it? And the source doesn't stop there. It also mentions the rise of Andrew Jackson coming soon after this period.
Right, Jackson. His arrival really shook things up.
Cemented the end of that single-party dominance, ushered in a whole new era of really intense partisan politics.
Yeah, his presidency saw the Democratic-Republicans split, right, into the Jacksonian Democrats, and then eventually the Whigs formed to oppose him.
Exactly. That transition, the source suggests, really marked the return, or maybe the full arrival, of the kind of competitive, often pretty combative party politics we still see today.
Jackson really leaned into that populist image, didn't he? Fighting the elites.
Definitely. Very confrontational style. And his era really solidified party loyalty as a key thing in American politics. A big shift away from that brief time when one party dominated, even if that domination wasn't, based on real unity.
So the source basically dismantles the label, shows us a period full of internal conflict, major economic stress, deep sectional divisions over slavery, far from good feeling.
Yeah, at best it's an oversimplification. At worst, maybe a historical misnomer.
It really challenges us to look past those catchy names for historical periods.
Absolutely. The reality is always more complex underneath.
But it's interesting, you pointed out the comment section on that source. There's a thought there, someone asking if there was ever a time when loyalty to the country seemed stronger than loyalty to party.
Right.
Even if the era of good feelings was flawed, maybe just the idea that such a time existed or was even aimed for feels significant compared to the intense partisanship we have now.
That comment really does make you think, doesn't it? It shifts the question a bit. Not was it perfectly unified, but did any period offer a real contrast to today's polarization?
Yeah.
So, looking back from where we are now, maybe even a brief, imperfect moment where national concerns seem to trump party lines feels noteworthy. Less about achieving perfect unity, more about a relative difference from today's norm.
And there's another quick mention in those comments, too, about the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening happening around the same time.
Yeah, someone connected those dots.
The idea being maybe a period of widespread religious revival, focusing on a shared spiritual purpose, might have encouraged people to temporarily put aside smaller political fights for something bigger.
It's an interesting correlation raised in the comments, yeah.
Yeah.
Suggesting that maybe these big cultural or spiritual movements can sometimes create a sense of shared identity that might, temper political divisions for a while.
Not necessarily the cause, but maybe a contributing factor to any unity that did exist.
Possibly. It just adds another layer of a complexity to think about.
Okay, so this first part of our dive gives us this critical look at a specific slice of U.S. history. It challenges the simple label, highlights the real conflicts underneath.
Economic panic, slavery, political infighting.
But it also sparks this reflection, prompted by the sources themselves, about whether even the aspiration for such a period matters when we look at today's divisions.
It's a great reminder that history needs that critical eye. You have to dig deeper than the labels to understand the complexities and how they echo today.
Which leads us nicely into our next section, actually, expanding on that idea. Historical context and contemporary conflict, basically using history as a lens.
Right, moving from analyzing one period to thinking more broadly about how history helps us understand conflicts now. And for this, we're drawing on that source focused on Stellenbosch University.
And this source makes a pretty bold claim, doesn't it? That history, if we engage with it properly, could potentially douse campus infernos or other big societal fights.
It's a powerful metaphor, yeah. The core idea is that historical perspective adds crucial context, complexity, maybe even a sense of shared human experience across time. And that understanding can help clarify, maybe even de-escalate, current disputes that might otherwise just be fueled by raw emotion or fights over symbols.
Douse campus infernos. It's memorable. What kinds of historical infernos or movements does the source use to illustrate this? Or to show how history gets used or maybe misused in these fights?
It brings up some really heavy historical examples. Nazi Germany is a major one.
Okay.
Referencing the horrific systematic destruction of intellectual and cultural life. The source mentions the book burnings.
Right, targeting specific authors.
Yeah, Marx, Engels, Thomas Mann, Heinrich Mann, Brecht, Adorno, Bloch, Lukács, Arndt, the list goes on. And the persecution of the thinkers themselves. It names names like Hitler, Goebbels, Heydrich, Rosenberg.
Highlighting that this was state-sponsored destruction of knowledge.
Exactly. A really stark example of what happens when a regime tries to actively erase history and thought. A powerful negative example.
Chilling. What other examples does it use?
It also points to the destruction of cultural property in more recent conflicts, like Syria.
Okay, so it's not just a thing of the past.
No. Destroying history and culture remains a tactic in modern warfare and conflict, too.
And then the source shifts to protest movements that might feel more immediate, especially thinking about universities.
Right. It brings up the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, obviously a pivotal struggle against racial injustice that profoundly challenged America. It also mentions the Rhodes Must Fall movement that started in Cape Town, demanding a statue of Cecil Rhodes be removed, but it spread globally, sparking huge debates about decolonization, racism, historical legacies.
Became a real flashpoint.
Definitely. And it also includes Black Lives Matter, the contemporary movement focusing on systemic racism and police brutality.
So a real range there. State destruction, major social movements. What's the source's main argument about how these movements relate to history, law, politics, that kind of thing?
Well, it draws a bit of a contrast, especially comparing movements like Rhodes Must Fall or maybe certain aspects of Black Lives Matter to something like the U.S. Civil Rights Movement.
How so?
The argument presented in the source is that the Civil Rights Movement was deeply, deeply rooted in a rigorous engagement with American history, with constitutional law, political philosophy.
Okay.
It was challenging the nation based on its own stated ideals while forcing an acknowledgement of its historical failures. But the source suggests some contemporary conflicts might focus more heavily on symbolic targets and perhaps more immediate emotional responses.
So the suggestion is maybe less engagement with the deep intellectual or historical roots compared to past movements. Is that the idea?
That seems to be the distinction the source is trying to draw. It's asking, are today's infernos built on that critical engagement with complex ideas in history? Or do they operate more through symbolic actions and expressions of feeling?
And the implication is that a deeper historical grounding might be better, more effective.
The source suggests it could provide a more robust framework for challenging injustice, potentially leading to more sustainable change rather than just symbolic wins or ongoing stalemates.
And it connects this idea to the specific context of Stellenbosch University, where the source comes from, mentioning portraits of controversial figures there.
Yes, figures like Cecil Rhodes, Jan Smuts, Hendrik Verwoerd, all representing different, though often connected, parts of South Africa's colonial and apartheid history.
Right. Rhodes the colonialist, Verwoerd the architect of apartheid, Smuts, more complex, but still linked to segregation.
Exactly. And the source uses these portraits as a concrete example, it asks. Is simply removing a portrait, even if it's symbolically powerful, a true engagement with the incredibly complex histories these men represent.
The source is arguing that history, understood more deeply looking at the full context, their actions, ideologies, the systems they build, could offer a more profound perspective than just removing the symbol.
That's the idea. Instead of just erasing the symbol, using history as a tool to really understand why they're controversial, the full impact, how their legacies still shape things today.
So the argument is this deeper understanding could potentially douse the inferno by offering a more nuanced picture, moving the debate beyond just symbolic clashes.
That's the hope
Yeah.
expressed in the source, yeah, moving towards more substantive issues.
So this source really challenges us, the readers, the listeners, to think critically about how history is being used in debates today.
Exactly. Is it a tool for genuine understanding, trying to find resolution, or is it being, selectively weaponized to just fuel emotions and conflict?
It raises big questions about the sort of intellectual depth of some contemporary movements. Are they engaging with history and complex ideas like past movements did? Or is the focus elsewhere?
The source implies that relying too heavily on just the immediate emotional impact or symbolic representation might limit the potential for real, lasting change and understanding.
So thinking about this for you, the listener, when you see news about protests or debates over statues or campus conflicts, how does understanding these different historical examples, Nazi Germany, the civil rights movement strategies, Rhodes Must Fall's focus on symbols, change how you might interpret what's happening?
Yeah, does it make you pause and ask, is history being used here to genuinely inform, to douse the flames? Or is it maybe being used to fan them?
It pushes for a deeper level of critical thinking, doesn't it? About the arguments being made, the methods being used.
Are people showing a nuanced grasp of the history they're invoking? Or is it more about the symbolic power and emotional hit?
Okay. So part one showed us historical labels can be misleading, and part two shows history itself is this powerful, complex force in today's conflicts. It can enlighten or inflame.
Highlights that ongoing tension, right? Between simplifying things, whether it's history or current debates, and the need for that deeper, more critical understanding.
Right. Okay, now we're going to shift gears pretty significantly, but we'll see some of these themes, language, interpretation, conflict, definitely reappear. We're moving into part two, focusing on that very current, very controversial topic, drawing from our third source, analyzing that U.S. Department of Justice memo on capital punishment.
Okay. And this memo, it's clear from the source discussion you provided, that Reddit thread, it has ignited intense debate and, frankly, alarm.
Yeah, so it's really important we look closely at the specific language in the memo that caused such a reaction, particularly in Section 2, right?
That's the crux of it. The specific phrasing that grabbed everyone's attention is, and aliens who traverse our borders and remain in the United States without legal status.
That phrase and how it's positioned, how it connects to the rest of the sentence, that seems to be ground zero for the whole debate in the source.
Absolutely. The source explains the memo's stated purpose is to reinstate and maybe expand an older policy from 2018 about seeking the death penalty in certain drug cases.
Okay.
But the new memo says this policy shall also be applied to cases involving non-drug capital crimes committed by cartels, transnational criminal organizations, and aliens who traverse our borders and remain in the United States without legal status.
Okay, so it explicitly connects applying this death penalty policy to three groups: cartels, transnational criminal organizations, and then that specific group, aliens who traverse our borders and remain without legal status. And that little word "and" seems to be what everything splits, where the interpretations just diverge wildly in the source discussion.
It really is the pivot point. The source discussion reveals this stark divide in how people are reading that phrase and what they think the memo actually means or intends.
Okay, let's try and lay out those two main interpretations that come through in the source material, starting with the one that seems, well, much more alarmed.
Okay. Interpretation A, let's call it. As presented by some commenters in the source, this view is extremely alarmed. They see the memo as a massive red flag for genocide.
Wow.
Or at the very least, that it effectively makes being undocumented itself a capital crime, or that it's a deliberate, sneaky step towards being able to target people just based on their immigration status for the most severe punishment, possibly death.
Okay, that's extremely serious. What arguments are people in the source making to support that level of alarm?
Well, a core argument, really highlighted in the source, focuses on interpreting that word "and."
Right.
Some commenters argue this sentence structure implies that the final category, aliens who traverse our borders, is a separate group. A distinct category subject to this death penalty policy, maybe regardless of whether they've committed any other capital crime.
So the ambiguity isn't accidental. They think it's put there on purpose.
That's a strong concern voiced in this part of the source discussion, yes. The fear is that the phrasing is deliberately vague, that it creates a loophole, a mechanism they can exploit later to target people just for being undocumented after crossing the border, without needing to prove they committed some separate capital offense.
And this view, the alarmist one in the source, it draws some pretty heavy historical parallels to emphasize the danger.
It does. Very serious ones. Commenters make direct comparisons to historical atrocities, specifically mentioning Hitler's actions,
Like what?
like manipulating citizenship laws, rounding up targeted groups. The source mentions Dachau being referenced.
Dachau, the concentration camp.
Yeah, emphasizing its origins as a place for political prisoners for perceived undesirables, including those the regime deemed illegal immigrants. The comparison is used to underscore this fear of a slippery slope towards mass persecution and detention based purely on status. It highlights the perceived existential threat in the memo's language.
And the source also shows concerns that this memo isn't just a standalone thing, that it connects to other policies or agendas.
Yes, definitely. Some in the source link it to other proposals or policies they see as targeting specific groups. Project 2025 gets mentioned.
Which is described as a conservative transition plan.
Right.
Yeah.
And they cite concerns that this plan includes things like proposals to classify transgender people as sex offenders. The fear expressed is that the memo is part of a bigger, coordinated strategy.
The strategy to do what?
To designate various groups, the source mentions examples like Antifa, Palestine supporters, the LGBTQ+ community as criminal or terrorist organizations, which could potentially make them vulnerable down the line to extreme policies like this one.
And this fear extends to how people might be targeted. Concerns about fabricated charges, lack of due process.
That's right. The source shows significant worry that due process could just be thrown out the window. Fears that charges could be trumped up to fit the criteria.
And using specific locations.
Yeah, fears that places operating outside the normal federal courts, like Guantanamo Bay Gitmo, might be used to detain people, avoiding the usual legal scrutiny. The Laken-Riley Act comes up in the source discussion here.
How so?
Apparently discussed as a potential legal tool that could be used to send undocumented individuals arrested for certain crimes to Gitmo. It just feeds into this fear that standard legal protections could be bypassed entirely.
So fundamentally, this perspective in the source questions whether the administration feels bound by law at all. That they might just redefine capital crimes or ignore legal constraints.
That's a key part of this alarmist view in the source, yes.
Yeah.
A deep distrust. A fear that they could ignore Congress, change definitions by executive action, or just use policies in legally dubious ways leading to extrajudicial actions or detention.
Okay, so that's interpretation A from the source discussion. Sees the language as intentionally ambiguous, a possible step towards genocide or making status a capital crime, fueled by historical fear and perceives links to a broader agenda.
Now, let's switch to interpretation B. The less alarmist view, also present in the source discussion. This perspective argues, no, the memo does not make illegal presence a capital crime, and the alarmist view is based on a misreading or an exaggeration.
Okay, what are the arguments from the source supporting this interpretation?
Well, the primary counterargument, and it's heavily emphasized in the source from this side, is the importance of reading the full text and the context of the memo.
Right.
They point out the memo explicitly says it applies the policy to capital crimes committed by aliens who are illegally present, and it lists specific types of existing federal crimes, like drug offenses or violent crimes.
Okay, so the illegal presence isn't the crime itself, it's describing the person who committed an already existing capital crime.
Exactly. This interpretation in the source argues that being undocumented is seen by the memo not as a standalone capital offense, but as a potential aggravating factor in cases where an undocumented person has already committed a crime that is already defined as capital under current federal law.
And this is crucial. Why can't this DOJ memo just change the law or create new capital crimes on its own?
This is a fundamental legal point raised in the source by those taking this view. They correctly state that under the U.S. Constitution, only Congress can define federal crimes and set the penalties, including the death penalty.
Not the Department of Justice.
No. A DOJ memo is an internal policy document. It tells federal prosecutors how to apply existing laws. It doesn't have the legal power to create new crimes or add to the list of capital offenses. That legal constraint is a key check on executive power, and it's highlighted in the source.
So even if the memo's wording is awkward or maybe politically motivated, legally, it can't just override Congress.
That's the core argument from this perspective in the source. They believe the existing legal system, judicial review, court challenges provides a safeguard. Any attempt to actually prosecute someone solely for their immigration status as a capital crime based on this memo would likely be struck down by the courts.
And what about the comparisons to genocide? This side pushes back on that in the source, too.
Yes. Some commenters in the source specifically reference the standard international definition of genocide.
Which involves targeting specific groups.
Right, based on their particular national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And they argue that the categories in the memo, illegal immigrants, cartels, and transnational criminal organizations, simply don't fit that definition of a protected group.
So, from this viewpoint in the source, while the policy might be harsh, maybe discriminatory, calling it genocide is seen as inaccurate hyperbole, not supported by the law or the likely scope of the memo.
That's the argument. This perspective in the source urges caution against using that kind of alarmist language if it isn't strictly supported by legal text or definitions.
Right.
They feel it hinders reasoned debate.
Okay, but what about the awkward phrasing itself, that ambiguity around "and" that the other side focuses on so much?
Those taking the less alarmist view in the source, they often acknowledge the wording is poor, maybe confusing.
But they don't see it as intentional.
Not necessarily. They tend to interpret the phrase about aliens who traverse our borders as modifying the type of capital case the policy should focus on specifically. Capital crimes committed by individuals who are illegally present, often linking them implicitly to the cartel activity mentioned right before it in the sentence.
So maybe just clumsy writing.
Some commenters in the source flat out suggest it could just be a hell of a typo, or just reflects rushed, incompetent drafting by bureaucrats, rather than some sinister, intentional ambiguity designed for future misuse.
Attributing it to error rather than malice.
Basically, yes. And this perspective also points out something important. The death penalty is already legally applicable under federal law for various capital crimes, regardless of someone's immigration status.
Oh, okay.
So they argue the memo might just be reinforcing existing policy, maybe adding a new emphasis like non-drug crimes cartels, rather than introducing something fundamentally new, illegal, or automatically genocidal based only on immigration status.
It sounds like the core of this less alarmist view in the source is really hammering on reading the full document carefully and understanding the existing legal limits.
Absolutely. That call to read the memo comes up again and again from this side in the source discussion, emphasizing that a careful look at the exact words in the context of existing law is crucial before jumping to these wildly different conclusions.
So the debate captured in that source material is incredibly stark. One side sees deep danger in ambiguous language, historical echoes, perceived intent.
A direct threat based on status.
And the other side insists on legal reality, textual analysis, arguing it targets capital crimes committed by undocumented people, not the status itself.
It's a really powerful snapshot of how the same official piece of paper can be read in such dramatically different ways, leading to totally opposite conclusions and levels of fear, especially, in a climate of low trust and high political tension.
And just to reiterate for everyone listening, our role here is just to lay out these different interpretations as they appear in the source material you shared with us. We're showing the arguments made on both sides within that source.
Right. We're not endorsing either view, the alarmist or the less alarmist.
Our aim is simply to help you understand the range of the debate that's happening around this document and the reasons behind the different arguments, all based on that source material.
Exactly.
Now, beyond that core interpretation fight, the source discussion also brings up some related concerns, other perspectives that add context. What were some of those?
One concept that gets mentioned is something called Wilhoit's Law.
Okay, what's that?
It's described in the source comments as basically the idea that for right-wingers, the only consistent principle is using double standards that favor them.
Ah, okay. How is that applied here?
It's brought up in the context of perceived hypocrisy, suggesting that those pushing policies like this memo might ignore similar or worse actions by their allies while aggressively targeting groups they oppose, like undocumented immigrants. It's a framing used in the source to critique the perceived motives behind the policy.
Got it. What about worries looking ahead, future concerns?
Yeah, there are significant concerns voiced in the source, even by some who lean towards the less alarmist reading of this specific memo. The fear isn't just what this document does now, but what it might signal or pave the way for.
Like what?
Like worries that Congress could pass new laws in the future that actually do make illegal presence a capital crime, or that executive orders might be used in legally questionable ways, bypassing normal processes, even if this memo itself is limited.
So even if this memo has legal limits, the fear in the source is it's part of a worrying trend, indicating an intent that could show up in more drastic forms later.
Yes. Some in the source see it as maybe testing the waters or setting a precedent for future, more extreme policies or legal shifts.
The comparison of Gitmo to a concentration camp also appears in the source discussion, which is obviously a very strong claim.
That comparison is made in the source.
Yeah.
Yeah, as part of those broader fears about detention outside normal legal rules. It connects to the anxiety about people being held without standard due process, especially with the Lake and Riley Act being mentioned as potentially sending people there. It really amplifies fears about detention conditions and rights.
There's also talk in the source about treason as a capital crime and who might get targeted.
Yes, some commenters in the source raise the potential for the charge of treason being used selectively, speculating about who, in today's political climate, might get labeled a traitor by those in power. It reflects anxiety about weaponizing serious charges against political opponents.
And then there's a really pointed observation made in the source about things already happening at the border, particularly in Texas.
Right. The source mentions reports of Texas putting up measures described as booby-trapping the border, measures that have apparently led to migrant deaths.
And the argument is?
The commenter argues that this action, regardless of the legal status of crossing the border, effectively treats it as if it were already a capital crime, given the lethal results.
That's a powerful claim from the source, suggesting the real-world impact on the ground might already be embodying the harshness being debated in the memo.
Yeah, it connects the abstract legal debate directly to tangible actions and their perceived deadly consequences, as discussed by people in the source.
And there's an interesting point made about how the debate itself seems to shift because of this memo.
One commenter in the source notes that the intense focus here risks changing the whole societal conversation about capital punishment. Instead of, should we execute people at all, the debate narrows down to a potentially more divisive question. Should we execute this specific group, meaning undocumented immigrants?
Highlighting how one policy document can actually reshape the whole public discussion, moving from universal principles to the status of one particular group.
It's a point made in the source about how political language and policy framing really can shape and maybe limit the public conversation.
And lastly, the source includes that quote from George Orwell's 1984.
Yeah, about how a ruling group only falls if it lets a standard of comparison exist, and that the masses don't revolt just because they're oppressed, but because they have that standard of comparison.
Well, how is that connected to the memo debate in the source?
It's brought into the source discussion, especially by those with the alarmist view, in the context of worries about authoritarianism, information control, potential for dissent.
Okay.
The implication seems to be that understanding history, recognizing patterns of oppression, knowing about rights and alternatives, that is the necessary standard of comparison. It lets people see when they're being oppressed and maybe resist. So in the context of the memo, perhaps understanding historical parallels, legal frameworks, definitions like genocide that provides the benchmark to measure actions against, preventing just passive acceptance.
Okay. So part 2 has really taken us deep into one single current document and the incredibly intense, complex debate around its meaning and implications, showing that whole spectrum of interpretation from the source material.
It's a really clear example of how legal language, perceived political motives, historical fears, and just deep-seated distrust can all collide to create a hugely charged public debate around an official document.
Right. Okay, now for part 3. Let's try and, connect the dots here. How do these seemingly separate sources that look back at U.S. unity division, the role of history in conflict, and this very current, very fiery debate over the DOJ memo, how do they relate to each other?
Well, we started with the era of good feelings, right? And we found the reality was way more complex than the label. Even a time held up as unified was actually full of internal divisions, facing huge crises that expose these fundamental disagreements.
And that historical perspective, it gives crucial context for the kind of intense political polarization and these passionate, sometimes really bitter debates we see now, including the one around the DOJ memo. It reminds us that periods of unity in U.S. history might be fragile, maybe even illusory sometimes, and that deep division, maybe in different forms, is kind of a recurring theme. Makes today's infernos feel maybe less totally unprecedented, even if the specifics are worrying.
Absolutely. Those historical cycles we saw in part 1 help contextualize the depth of the political disagreement we see reflected in that memo debate in part 2.
Then we looked at the role of history itself from that Stellenbosch source. The argument that history could be a tool to douse conflicts, give context, complexity, critical perspective. But we also saw the flip side. Historical parallels and symbols can be used in ways that actually inflame emotions, make conflict worse, rather than truly inform.
And that connects directly to the memo debate we just dissected. Both sides in that discussion, as the source showed, lean heavily on historical comparison.
Right, from Nazi Germany and Dachau on the alarmist side.
There may be implicit comparisons with past legal or political fights by the less alarmist side arguing for sticking to constitutional principles.
So the question raised by that Stellenbosch source becomes really relevant. In the memo debate, are these historical comparisons being used effectively to give real perspective, maybe cool things down?
Or are they mainly rhetorical weapons, used to crank up the alarm, score points, inflame passions? It really highlights that dual nature of using history in public arguments.
It can illuminate, or it can just muddy the waters.
And the source material around the memo really forces you to think about which one is happening.
And another thread running through all three sources is this challenge of interpreting complex information.
Definitely.
In part one, we interpreted the era of good feelings label against the messy reality. In part two, we saw wildly different, fiercely debated interpretations of the same short bit of legal text in the DOJ memo.
And the Stellenbosch source talked about needing deeper historical engagement, getting beyond just the superficial symbols.
It shows how fundamental interpretation is, doesn't it? Different viewpoints, different levels of trust, different backgrounds. They all lead people to read the same information history, a political label, a legal memo, and come away with totally different conclusions, sometimes leading to really profound alarm or complete dismissal.
It's central to understanding these disputes.
And finally, the power of language itself. That's clear across all these sources, too.
Absolutely.
That label, era of good feelings, shaped how people initially saw that period, even if it was wrong. The specific wording in the DOJ memo, especially that little word "and," became the absolute flashpoint of a heated, high-stakes debate. Its interpretation could shape public understanding, fuel conflict.
And the Stellenbosch source implicitly was about how the language we use to frame history or current movements really impacts how they're seen and reacted to.
Language is never neutral, is it? The words we choose matter hugely.
They shape understanding, shape debate, shape how people might respond. Poor wording, whether it's accidental or deliberate, can have really serious consequences for trust, for public perception, for the whole nature of political discussion.
Okay, so connecting all these dots back to you, the listener, how does understanding these things, the nuances behind historical labels, the dual role history plays today, the multiple, sometimes alarming ways a legal document can be read, how does that help you navigate the information you see every day and form your own informed view?
Well, hopefully it provides a kind of framework for critical engagement, right? It encourages you to look past the headlines, the simple labels, to question how history is being used when you hear an argument, to maybe try and read original documents when you can, and to consider multiple interpretations and the reasons behind them before just accepting one narrative, especially on these really charged topics.
It's about developing a more sophisticated way of taking in information, recognizing that complexity, interpretation, the use of language, they're always part of the picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Seeing the shades of gray, understanding why people might see things differently, and maybe resisting that urge to jump to the simplest conclusion.
Okay. That brings us towards the conclusion of this deep dive into the source materials you provided us.
We've really unpacked quite a bit. We looked at the complex reality behind that era of good feelings label, saw the divisions lurking beneath the surface.
We examined the powerful, double-edged nature of history, how it can give essential context, but also how historical parallels can be used to inflame instead of inform.
And we spent a lot of time analyzing that intense debate around the DOJ memo on capital punishment and undocumented immigrants, highlighting those starkly different interpretations presented within the source material itself.
Yeah, it's clear from all these sources that navigating history and current policy debates requires really careful attention to detail.
And an awareness of different perspectives, their underlying assumptions, and a critical eye for how language and history are being used.
That debate over the DOJ memo, especially, it's such a potent example, isn't it? How the precise meaning of legal text, plus perceived political intent, plus historical fears, plus a lack of trust, how all that can converge to create this incredibly charged, deeply contested issue, with really serious fears being voiced about what it could all mean.
It really underscores the challenges we face when trying to interpret official documents in such a polarized environment.
So as a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on, building on all this, think about that ongoing tension. The tension between the precise intended meaning of text, whether they're legal or historical, and the broader interpretations, often politically charged or emotionally driven, that get applied to them by different groups.
Yeah, how do we navigate that gap?
How do societies make sure public discussions stays grounded in verifiable facts, in reasoned analysis, when language can be seen as ambiguous, history can be weaponized selectively, and trust in institutions is low?
It raises really big questions about critical thinking, about media literacy, about how we maintain a healthy public conversation.
Something to think about as you continue your own deep dives into complex topics.
Definitely.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source materials you shared. We really hope exploring these topics together has been valuable for you, helped you feel more informed, maybe better equipped to analyze the information you come across.
Keep thinking critically. Keep exploring these complex issues on your own.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, please do take a moment to subscribe. Maybe like it, leave a comment. It really helps us understand what connects with you.
Yeah, let's just keep bringing you these in-depth explorations based on the sources you provide.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.
Thank